for all intents and purposes, the process began in the spring of 2002 at a G8 Security Donors Conference in Geneva. The Taliban fell in the fall of 2001, so there was a bit of a gap before a coherent process was established. At this Geneva meeting, the various G8 donors decided on essentially a division of labor for the SSR process in Afghanistan, where they divided the process into 5 pillars, and they attached a lead donor to each of those pillars to facilitate reforms and provide assistance to the reform process. So in the military reform pillar, the United States was the main provider of assistance, or was the lead donor. For counter-narcotics, the government of Britain. For the disarmament, demobilization, reintegration of ex-combatants, Japan. For judicial reform, Italy. And for police reform, Germany. So essentially, this is when you start to see more coherent activity in security sector reform start to begin in Afghanistan. There was a few ad hoc programs that were established prior to this meeting, but for all intents and purposes, you can see that as the beginning point for the process. The form the process has taken was first in the early phase was really dictated by this 5-pillar donor support strategy established by the G8, and which again, the 5 pillars being military reform, police reform, judicial reform, the disarmament, demobilization, reintegration of ex-combatants, and counter-narcotics. So it's quite a comprehensive approach. The problem, however, with this approach was there was no overarching coordination structure to really draw out the synergies between the pillars. Security sector reform is supposed to be a holistic process where all of these different elements are supposed to be very much advanced in unison or coordinated very carefully. This was not necessarily the case in Afghanistan. So, for instance, we saw in Afghanistan the military reform process advanced very quickly by the United States, and the police reform lagged behind. We saw, now the problem when you have one pillar outpacing another is that often they are, the performance of actors in one are dependent on a certain level of functionality in another. So the police cannot do their job if there is not an effective judiciary. Right. So, even if you have the best trained police in the world in Afghanistan, for instance, if the judiciary is not operating efficiently and effectively according to the rule of law and largely free of corruption, then the police frankly just cannot do their job. They can arrest people, but then they might be released when they reach the courts anyways, because the courts don't have the capability to try the person, or they'll release due to corruption or mismanagement. So there wasn't the degree of coordination that's absolutely essential for a security sector reform process in Afghanistan. Other areas that were kind of missing links were the governance aspect. So there were a system put in place to support programs in those 5 pillars, but there wasn't as much of an overarching effort to establish the accountability structures, democratic oversight structures, management structures at the executive, at the legislative level, and within individual security and justice line institutions to ensure that the sector was managed and governed according to democratic principles, which of course is one of the main goals of security sector reform. There are a number, beyond the main G8 countries, there are a number of other actors that are involved in the process. So for instance, Canada is involved in some activities, and judicial reform has been involved in demilitarization activities, does provide some support for efforts to build up the Afghan National Army. So Canada has been a very important security sector player, and there are a number of other actors, primarily Western states, that have had a significant amount of involvement. Now, I should say that the G8 5-pillar donor support system was sort of the only game in town during the early phases of the process, but has essentially now been disbanded. Now, you see that still the former lead donors still have a prominent role in their former areas or spheres of influence, areas of responsibility. However, now, for all intents and purposes, the U.S., the United States, is the lead donor to 4 out of the 5 pillars, perhaps with the exception of demilitarization, because it's providing the most money to all of those pillars by a very significant margin. So the whole lead nation concept is somewhat redundant. Moreover, there has been a move in Afghanistan to really emphasize local or Afghan ownership of the process. And so what has happened is you've now, in terms of the language and the discourse that's used, it's no longer talking about foreign lead donors, but Afghan ownership and leadership of the process, an Afghanized process. So I think that's where the movement is. But if you really want to know who is the main actor pushing security sector reform, even though there are a whole range of donors involved, it's really the U.S. that's the most consequential one. Well, in a post-conflict environment such as Afghanistan, although I suppose in contemporary Afghanistan, considering the high levels of insecurity, it would even be a dubious assertion to refer to Afghanistan as post-conflict. But in an area with a high level of insecurity, recovering from conflict, SSR provides the state or provides the country with a basic precondition for statehood, and that's a monopoly over the use of coercive force. Also, in many of these countries, in many post-conflict countries, the security forces in the past have been a driver of insecurity. They've, engaged in repressive activities. They are viewed as an object of fear by the population. So, reforming these institutions according to democratic standards, ensuring that they're accountable to civilian authority, some of the basic tenets of security sector reform, is a part of establishing a sustainable peace, building the trust of the population in the state, reestablishing, in a sense, the social compact in society. Well, I mean, just like all aspects of the reconstruction and the process in Afghanistan, a number of successes have been achieved. You see that in the Afghan National Army although it's only about half the size that it will be, when it reaches its force ceiling, has still shown itself to be quite effective in combat situations. It's now planning its own operations even. It still, for most part, relies on U.S.-led coalition forces or NATO forces now for logistical support to actually engage in combat activity, but has really made significant strides in establishing itself as a very effective security unit in Afghanistan. Or security force in Afghanistan. So there's been that's certainly one of the big success stories. I mean, the disarmament, demobilization, reintegration program under the leadership of the Afghan New Beginnings program, which is primarily a UN overseen organization, was completed. This program was completed in 2006. Resulting in over 60,000 militiamen being demobilized, over 60,000 weapons collected. Now there are still a significant amount of Afghans obviously under arms, militiamen under arms. It didn't succeed in fully breaking down many of the militia patronage networks in the country, but still it can be seen as significant progress, I believe. So there are and in a number of other areas there are significant steps have been made. The process is not without success stories. However, when you look at the broader picture, the police is still one of the most dysfunctional organizations in the country, and of course this is the main interface between state and society. I mean, often in many communities in Afghanistan, the only interaction they have with the state is through their local police force, and frankly, it's a corrupt, largely predatory and abusive organization. That, of course, very much colors the impressions people have of the security sector reform process. The judiciary is still in a desperate state, primarily due to underinvestment, but also, it just hasn't received the attention, generally speaking, that it deserves. So there's a long way to go, and the process has certainly experienced a number of setbacks, but I think it would be a mistake to say that no progress has been made. Well, that's been one of the big problems. The ownership gap has been a big problem. Um, in reality, there is no body in Afghanistan, Afghan institution or actor that's been capable of managing the entire process. Holding the donors to account for the type of activities that they're implementing, but also ensuring that there is coherence in the activities and the reforms undertaken within the Afghan institutions themselves and the policies implemented among Afghan institutional bodies. There is in Afghanistan a Office of the National Security Council, which was established with donor support, which is essentially the Secretariat for a National Security Council in Afghanistan. I think there was a great deal of hope that this body, which on paper at least has a great deal of responsibility for overseeing the security sector reform process in the country, there's a great deal of hope that this organization would provide that leadership, essentially assert Afghan ownership over the process, give it an Afghan face, but really hasn't been endowed with the resources and really hasn't shown the political will to assert that role. And no other actor really has assumed that role in Afghanistan, which means that for the most part, while the Afghans have, the Afghan government, and in particular under the leadership of President Karzai, have signed off on most of the major elements of the security sector reform process. For the most part, it is still donor-driven, and so that really makes you think. You have to think very hard about whether some of these activities that are and reforms being undertaken are actually sustainable in the end, if they haven't been really designed by the Afghans. I think one of the success stories of Afghanistan is the media has been shown to be extremely vibrant. And I think the media has provided some coverage of the security sector reform process. But I think that overall, there could be far more engagement of civil society in the process, whether it's Afghan non-governmental organizations, community organizations, or traditional security and justice actors, traditional sources of authority, whether it be tribal elders, whether it be local shuras, and so on. There could be more of engagement on a broader level, I think, in the security sector reform process, more consultation by the Afghan government and the international community, and also they have a very important role as an external oversight body to ensure that the security institutions in the country are following the Constitution, that the fundamental rights are not being violated in any way, that these are transparent and accountable bodies, and that they're fulfilling their obligation to the population to uphold their security, human security. I think another success story, which I omitted, was the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission, which I think has done a fantastic job at highlighting, the situation, the human rights situation across Afghanistan through advocacy, research, and so on, and has really held the government to account for some of the abuses that have been carried out by the police. Many of the complaints that the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission receives have been about the Afghan police. And so then this is a way of really, they've been effectively been able to provide some oversight and track the effectiveness of reforms in terms of how it actually affects Afghan people, citizens. Well, I think there has to be better coordination structures. So, for instance, at various points in the process, there has been discussions about establishing SSR coordination committees, both at the working level but also at the high policy level, to ensure coherence in policy and then coherence in implementation. None of these bodies which have been proposed from both the Afghan and international side have really taken root. They've usually these proposals have usually collapsed over time. So I think that there was a need for more a coordination in the process to ensure coherence across the pillars. And I think also, obviously, as I've already discussed, I mean, there has been an ownership gap in Afghanistan. I think that there has to be more attention on really empowering Afghan institutions to fully support the process, to engage on a more intense level in design and also so that they invest more political capital in the process. They feel attached to the process, because I think that sometimes is lacking. Well, I think that one thing you have to bear in mind is that this is a long-term process. I mean, the security sector reform in almost any context, specifically one as complex as Afghanistan, a country that's emerged from 3 decades of war, a country which is facing, a complex insurgency right now. I think if you, in such a difficult environment, you just have to recognize the fact that this is perhaps a generational process, that it's going to take decades to complete this process. So you have to moderate your expectations, you have to be realistic, and I don't think donors always have. They've expected to build an army, to build an effective and accountable police within a one donor funding cycle, within 5 years, and that, simply speaking, is unrealistic. But I think that there's also, certainly there have been some setbacks, so I think that there's a need to really go back to the, and there has been important reevaluations of where the process has gone, but I think that there's a need to really carefully consider, are some of the processes and programs being implemented now, are they sustainable over the long term? In other words, when the international community leaves, are these still viable? Are the institutions and structures being established viable? I think that that's a question that has to be asked, because certainly if we look on the issue of fiscal sustainability, many of the institutions being established in Afghanistan right now, it's hard to imagine when, if you look at the figures, when they could be sustained by the Afghan government without donor assistance. So I think that some hard questions really have to be asked about where the process is going. As I said, there has been some gains that have been made, so that provides a foundation to build upon. But you can't get away from the fact that the international community is going to have to remain engaged in Afghanistan for some time. That means providing troops that are capable of providing essentially a security buffer for security sector reform to move forward. That means providing the funds that will enable some of the critical reform processes to move forward, and of course providing the technical assistance and political and the type of political engagement that's needed to move the process forward. So it gets down to the fact that I think success is still possible, but it's going to be a long-term process, and we have to be prepared for that. As the international community has to be prepared for that.